Have you seen the Odyssey yet? Hello and welcome to the Coop-a-Log. Today we have a special episode for the Odyssey, which is of course the new film from Christopher Nolan, much anticipated after especially his wins with Oppenheimer. I am of a very different opinion around this film compared to everybody else, or at least the general consensus as it appears to be. So a few points I'd like to say just to preface. I've not read the book, but I've read the summary, and this is just mostly to compare how much of some of the things I did not like in the film, whether that is Nolan's own creation or a carryover from the book, because I think structurally there are some elements that did not work for me, and even if it was an inherent flaw of the book as an adaptation, I think they might have worked some things out, but actually they're not, but that's something we'll discuss later. So I watched this at the BFI IMAX, the one, the only, the crown jewel of Waterloo. It's a cinema I love dearly. It's a cinema I watched my first 70mm IMAX, which was Tenet, which is the film I love a lot, and I was lucky enough to be there for opening day. One of the handful of cinemas that are doing this in IMAX 70mm film print. I know they've been doing this for a while now in terms of June Part 2, of course, being a very big release, Joker, Project Hail Mary, and they are lucky enough to get those unique film prints. And with Oppenheimer, I remember there was quite a few more cinemas doing that across the world. I'm not sure if that was also the case for the Odyssey, but of course it's a big file format, and I have proof, I have evidence. See, here we have the IMAX 70mm film poster. You see, this is me, and this is Nolan. This is how. This is my mission statement. Me, Nolan. This is probably gonna be the thumbnail for the video. Because I have a lot of big criticisms for this film. Very loosely scripted, just like a Nolan film. No. Some of the research I've done before putting this together is reading the interview with Chris Nolan that New York Times did, I would assume, very recently, just in preparation for the film, and there were some interesting points there to understand the process behind this film and what his inspirations were. Some of them really caught me off guard there. The synopsis in general. Also, actually, because this is such a big event, a big deal, let me dress up a little bit, it's almost like not as sophisticated as Chris Nolan with his suits walking around everywhere, but maybe just elevated slightly. Although, you know what, the Katamari Damacy shirt, kind of the best anyway. So yeah, why not? Just because it's a big event, it's the Odyssey, right? So in terms of the synopsis, it's an adaptation of the Odyssey that is attributed to be written by Homer. Of course, this is an ancient Greek story which is about Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, who left his home to fight in the Trojan War, and the film follows his Odyssey back home. That's about as much as I could sum up a 3-hour film. There's a lot of things that happen, of course there is. And in terms of my criticisms, I don't even know where to start, because I have negative points across the board I want to flag. And I did not enjoy this film in general, but there are some interesting ideas. And that's how I would sum up my thoughts on the film as a whole, that it's a list of interesting ideas that are buried underneath a narrative pacing and editing style that feels more geared towards entertaining and making sure nobody's lost than exploring the idea. And this is something that Nolan has mentioned in that interview I mentioned, that accessibility is a big point for him, and I can only imagine that this is part of the response because of how much people didn't like Tenet. you know, it's a Chris Nolan film if it ends by the main character or somebody else explaining the whole point of the film. And the idea here is relatively interesting, I have to say. Or rather, what is interesting is the way it takes the source material and works on top of that, retains the general structure of what the book is like, but making it more grounded, and where within that there is fractured identity of the film in terms of it's trying to adapt the source material, but it picks and chooses elements from it to bring it up to the more grounded style that is expected by modern audiences, because in this film the mythical elements are very toned down, and I think the consequences from that on the film as a whole, that is such an interesting point for me. And what I mean by the editing and narrative style is, if you've seen quite a few Nolan films by now, I think you can see how he uses non-linear storytelling to make some of the stories that don't really have such a cathartic pacing to them, but he edits them in such a way. Think of the Oppenheimer. The way it cuts back and forward, conversation with Albert Einstein being the final moments of the film, and how it serves as this exclamation point to bring back the whole point of the film. And that is a scene that the film revisits a few times throughout the film, from I recall, at least once or twice. And we see that from the perspective of Strauss, and of course then from the perspective of Oppenheimer. Not to be spoilery, but yeah, I will be, well, I guess this is the appropriate time to provide some spoiler wordings, is that I will be mentioning some of the themes and the general ideas of the film without bringing direct examples or points. For one, I think it's a film that you would enjoy more as an experience anyway, rather than for its thematic elements, although they are present there and they are interesting. But I think as I will go later into the review, there are some of them that I just don't think end up landing that well. Point around the editing and pacing is specifically why, because it ends up revisiting one of the scenes at the end, and Oppenheimer made it so perfect, and then the Odyssey tries to replicate that in terms of having a scene, which interestingly enough, in the way it is presented in the book, it's also the same way it is presented in the film, from a narrative perspective, the way it moves. And then it's Nolan's addition to revisit that in the end, from my understanding of what I read on Wikipedia. According to school teachers, that is not a valid source. And here we are, people are just using AI and LLMs left, right, and center. But not me. Not me. And on one hand, I understand its purpose, because it provides this cathartic moment to tie the whole film together, because the ending is very important. I think you will find that revisiting a lot of Nolan's catalog, quite a few of his films rely on something similar. Think of Interstellar with that scene when he goes through and that reframes the earliest scenes in the film, or Prestige. It treats that narrative reframing as almost a little bit of a plot twist, to the point where it has an interesting idea that it's trying to say, but it feels too preoccupied in trying to and frame it as something exciting, rather than giving it the respect it deserves. And within that, it's a very fast food way of making films like that, which is also my point with Oppenheimer, which is a film that, for all of its exceptional qualities in terms of filmmaking, because as a film it is paced amazingly and it is very thrilling to watch for a 3-hour biopic that is mostly people talking in rooms, and it's that non-linear structure of, I would describe it as question and answer type editing, because the way it is framed, that it's almost like a courtroom drama, but instead of there being an actual courtroom, it's the small board meeting there, and the audience is almost like the courtroom that is judging Oppenheimer for his choices. And within that structure, the court asks Oppenheimer questions, and then that leads him to go back and recount the story, or part of his story. And Odyssey tries to do something similar, but it's not as successful as that, in my opinion. Within Oppenheimer, despite it being so well done, it made me feel like it tried to make this very complicated, serious theme into something that was more preoccupied with being exciting than giving the respect to the theme at the core of the story. Is in that sense, Nolan is almost Oppenheimer of his own, because he has this gift in some areas that he's able to manifest into some beautiful filmmaking at the cost of maybe not considering the impact of some of his decisions in the end. Even if you look at the poster of Oppenheimer and the Odyssey, they are very similar, with the visual iconography of a symbol and a man in front of the symbol. With the Oppenheimer, we have the atomic bomb, and Oppenheimer, the man who has created that and changed the world forever. And here we have the Trojan horse and Odysseus, a man whose strategic skills essentially caused, in some sense, the fracture of trust between people. And that is a big thematic element throughout the film, and it tries to analyze Odysseus as a person, as a man. Does some of that. Within that there is some interesting elements, and that's where I will again mention that all of my criticisms and points are directed at the film. I don't know how much of that is, even despite me doing some limited amount of research on the Odyssey, the book, and it's another can of worms given the amount of discussions around different translations, and from what I've read, that Nolan has read different translation over the course of his life, so I'm not sure how much of this would just carry over, and I do not judge it by those merits unless this is a point that is so important to the core of the book, to where changing it might change the whole story as a whole. That is not what this video is about, so I'm just mentioning that to shut down any essentially rebuttals that anybody might have. It's like, well, that's in the book. I was like, okay, but we're not talking about the book, we're talking about the film adaptation. And by the way, where that also leads me into is that there is some quippy dialogue in here that is so out of place. When a few of those elements came up, I was thinking to myself, there is no way that this is a carryover from the book. This is just an additions that are off the time, unfortunately, and that is just, I don't think this film will stand too well in the history of cinema, because it's so too much of its time, and within that it's a victim to the trends that are still prevalent in cinema as a whole. So it's no wonder that Tom Holland, who's playing Spider-Man, a very quippy character, will have quips of his own. Just to provide one example, I don't think it's gonna be too much of a spoiler. So there is a scene in the film where some beggar pulls off a cool move, and Tom Holland goes, "Huh, that's a really cool move for a beggar," something like that. And I heard that, I'm like, oh no, what are you doing? It's that level of not taking it seriously that is where the film ends up betraying itself. When you insert quips like that are irony poisoned quips of the 2026 level writing, to where any serious moment will inevitably be undercut by a joke. To be fair, there is not that much of those jokes in the film, but the fact that they are here shows you that Nolan has done a bit of tinkering with the source material, unless it would be really funny if that is actually in the original book. Although I very much doubt it, because I'm doing some research in terms of how much complexity there is of translating the original hexameter prose into English, which is very difficult to do from my understanding of the general mechanics of how the poem was written originally. So there is no way that Homer wrote something like, and Tom Holland said, "Cool moves for an old-timer." He didn't say it like that in the film. I'm just getting the point across as an example. Some other elements, and here I'm just providing some brief criticisms as bullet points, and then I will diverge a little bit more into general discussions about some elements I want to discuss more in particular. The other point I want to mention is that I think the average shot length in this film is probably 5 seconds? I don't know, or like half a second. There are so many points where it just cuts so frequently to the point where it's just really distracting, and that is not anything new, but I like my films to have a longer shot lengths. And that is very funny to think about when Chris Nolan mentioned that Andrei Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev and Akira Kurosawa's Ran were inspirations for this film. To be clear, he does not mention them as inspirations for the tone of the film, but the fact that he would mention those two phenomenal works in the same breath as his own film, that is so painfully amateurish in terms of its cinematography, is downright disrespectful to those films, and makes me question about his sensibilities as a director in general, because he mentions the texture of Andrei Rublev as being a big inspiration for the Odyssey, which I don't understand what he means by the word texture in this case, because it's a very vague term. And when talking about Andrei Tarkovsky films, it is not out of place to use vague terms because they are so ephemeral in terms of their tone and atmosphere. Those are the words I would mostly attribute to any discussions about Andrei Tarkovsky films. So by texture, I'm not sure if he's just talking about the way the film looks or something more, but even looking at a film like that and this level of spirituality that is present in that film, following Andrei Rublev, who was an iconographer for the church. So, you know, within this Greek mythology, it is also spiritual in the sense that it mentions gods frequently and by name, and that level of spirituality would have been relevant to mention here and carry over, potentially. And when I'm talking about Akira Kurosawa's Ran, that is a film that is so beautiful. The shots there, the blocking, the staging, it is all so masterful, and I find it funny that in that interview he mentioned it directly. He's like, oh, not in the sense of the style, but the interplay between the environment and the wind. To the point where I was like, why would you watch Ran and would be your takeaway? Your main takeaway? Do you not see the beautiful filmmaking at play here? The mise-en-scène? Do you not just want to maybe be inspired by that? And I'm, by the way, not the biggest fan of Ran. I prefer from, well, Akira Kurosawa, Seven Samurai, Yojimbo. Those are some of my favorites from him. I'm yet to watch quite a few of those. Yes, I'm saving them for special occasions. But I have seen Ran, and I would much rather watch Ran than the Odyssey. And that is a film that has very long takes, and the Odyssey does not. And also has those impact inserts that Nolan likes to spruce into his films. Some of them seem a little out of place, almost to the point where they're added there just to keep the shot length at an exciting pace, to make sure that people are engaged, whereas some of them are flashbacks that generally I don't have much qualms with, but some of them I was watching and I was like, oh, you're just trying to make this too exciting, just tone it down, believe in the audience a little bit. And on the point of the ending, again, this is very non-linear because you only have a few bullet points in this book, and I'm going through them as a stream of consciousness through my head, things I've just thought and sometimes think up on the spot, and then I can get carried away. That's why I'll be like, oh, let me just do a quick video. It's gonna be 15 minutes, and it ends up being an hour long. And this is specifically about my Evil Dead Burn review, because I love the Evil Dead Burn. If it's a film that I love a lot, I have a lot to say about it. I think my Tenet video will end up being quite lengthy as well. And as just a stream of consciousness, I think if I sat down and properly scripted it, might end up better, but another time. And here it's also the same thing where I'm just rambling on, and hopefully just having a few bullet points is gonna make it cohesive enough. And if it isn't, just call this Christopher Nolan non-linear structure. And if you were a big fan of the Odyssey, then you should get on with that really well. Chris Nolan, I like to be jumping back and forth between the ending and the actual narrative. And what I mean by that is that the ending is played almost like a plot twist that is supposed to reframe the rest of the film. And yeah, that's really hated that. Primarily because after having that scene, then the scene has a big fight that feels almost like a betrayal of the scene just before then. The main message of the film, because it gets a little bit moralizing, but in a way that I don't think is an issue in terms of the idea as a whole. If anything, I think that's a very interesting parallel that Chris Nolan came up with, because that seems to be his own original creation based on some of the research I did on the book specifically, and that was my hunch based on having seen a few of Nolan films prior to this. That is almost like a style of his own, something that he would add to add a more pathos and catharsis to the narrative pacing, to the narrative curve of the film, the character arc as well. And with that is, it essentially frames the whole story as the Trojan horse. By the way, this is gonna be loose spoilers in terms of the film, but then again, I am talking about the Odyssey, which is, to my knowledge, a very influential work that many people are familiar with. So I don't think that me telling you some of the general plot beats of the film are gonna be spoilers, because you would know them in general anyway. Everybody knows the Trojan horse story. The parallel it creates, and this is where my point about Oppenheimer / Odysseus parallel is, that the ingenuity of Odysseus of devising the Trojan horse ploy was essentially a betrayal of trust from the Trojans, who took in the horse as a gift, but it ended up being their downfall because they had the Greek soldiers hiding inside it, which betrayed the trust of a gift. That ended up finishing the long war. That Trojan horse story is presented as it is in the trailer, one of the trailers where Tom Holland goes and gets the story of what it was like inside the Trojan horse, which from what I've read is exactly how that is positioned in the book as well. And then in the end it gets brought up again, and from the perspective of Odysseus. And there's a quote there. This is a quote. This is like a direct spoiler, which I would assume that this is the Nolan addition to the film, is when those gates to Troy opened. That's when he saw 10 years of rage pour in, and that's where he saw horrors of war, and essentially it scarred him, and within that he betrayed the trust, the Zeus's law, which they mention several times, which is part of that guest friendship tradition where they invite the guests and they provide them food and shelter. That is, of course, one of the key foundations of civilization. And in that sense, it is like Oppenheimer, to where he did something that is so noteworthy in the history of humanity, and within that, it's a story had a notable impact on how people treat one another, how it shapes civilization and history as a whole. And the rest of the story is essentially them being punished for that by God, with them going to the Cyclops cave, going to a house of somebody and that somebody not enjoying the presence there, them going to another house of a witch who gives them a meal, which ends up being a trick, a few other ones. That's where there's an interesting thematic point to it all that is clever. I think that is a clever reframing. Everybody knows the story of the Trojan horse. It is so important, and just through sheer exposure and how ingrained it is into the general osmosis of human knowledge, that is a story of how betrayal is part of what it's like to be human. But despite that, we were able to overcome some of that and build a civilization. Enough people came together to build everything around us. That is a testament to the fact that people can work together. And the film tries to provide that moralizing message, but it doesn't feel too pretentious with that. But my point is that around all of that, the characters are not interesting enough to sustain that message. They're not a strong foundation upon which this message can be built. And the other elements that Nolan changed in the story, I think also end up betraying the foundation as a whole. And that is namely that because in the book, again, this is spoilers, but I think at this point most of the people that really care about the Odyssey have gone out of the way to see it, and those that plan to probably don't care like too much. But in the end, just like in the book, Odysseus ends up murdering all of the suitors. To me, there was a big issue between the movie having this message about the horrors of war and the impact it had on Odysseus. It's almost like traumatic event, which is how he was happy to be in Calypso's captivity, eating the lotus, which is, by the way, also a difference between the book and the story, because in the book she holds him captive, and Zeus needs to send Hermes to break him out of that. But because this is a grounded story that is being told in 2026, we need to have this elevated. It's almost like that same discussion of elevated horror, where it's all about trauma now, that we can't just have a horror film be a horror film, it has to be about something more than that. And this is similar with Odysseus, who's stuck with Calypso on this beach, where he, of his own free volition, keeps eating the lotus fruit to forget. He keeps himself drugged to avoid thinking of the horrors of what he has witnessed, of what he has actually done himself, and the consequences of that. That is a very clear distinction between the book and the story, and that is where I don't think the film comes together all that well. While in some elements, I think it is very interesting, the fact how it takes the original story and tries to build on top of that, but it does not do meaningful enough changes to make it land on too well. And to bring more points to support some of those claims, within that interview from New York Times, he described his process of developing his films using diagrams, which I can only assume is how he writes around the culmination of his films, and where the non-linear storytelling probably comes into effect, where he probably understands what the whole point of the film is, and then writes the story around that, apparently using post-it notes, and it's almost like board that he just like creates, probably like the I don't know, it's like some sort of like analogy in terms of how it's like a murder case, you know, where they put strings between all of the different plot points. And he is strong with that level of writing. But even in his own words, he says that he finds writing difficult and tries to discover the characters through writing. And that is where I think his issue with writing is, because this explains why his characters are so divorced from the story at large, because when he's writing, he does not have a clear idea of a character that he wants to write the story around. He tries to write and find the character through the process of writing, and that's where some of the plot elements can seem divorced from the story as a whole, and the characters feel like they're not part of the story and contributing to the story, but just have the story happen around them, to where the plot points don't always feel like they have a meaningful enough impact on the characters, or the characters don't have a meaningful enough point of agency to feel like those choices are earned. As I've seen some people mention, and I just kind of say this just so in case somebody knows, I've heard this quote before, and this is not my original quote, but Nolan writes ideas, plots, and themes, but not characters. Which is why I believe that Tenet is Chris Nolan's best film, because it is writing to his strengths. He is mostly focused on the ideas of what he wants that film to represent and explore, and the characters feel second to that. He is not trying to write around his weaknesses, he's writing to his strengths, which is a very high concept plot that is Tenet. But then how the characters are so limited. John David Washington's character doesn't even have a name. He's just known as the protagonist, because that's all he needs to be, because it's a story of a protagonist becoming the protagonist, and that's part of the theme of the story. That is where Kate's progression also lies, to where she becomes someone who's jealous of a person she sees jumping off the boat, and jealous of her freedom, until the end of the film, where she realizes that that is actually her. So she's jealous of her potential, of what she can be. And that is not something that Tenet tries to explain to you at the end of the film. And that is why Tenet was so poorly received, and I feel like ever since then, Nolan has been on this course correction of where he was trying to write around some of his weaknesses instead of writing to his strengths. And this is a comment not on Nolan and his style of writing. I think it's a comment about audiences not resonating with what Nolan is actually good at and what he's trying to get across, and that is really sad to me. And I think the similar story happened with Dunkirk, which is not mentioned too frequently compared to the likes of Interstellar, the Dark Knight trilogy, or Oppenheimer, of course, even the likes of Prestige. I think those are the main big films from him, of course. And Dunkirk is somewhere in the middle of those films and gets frequently forgotten in terms of discussions, because it doesn't have such a character for people to attach to in terms of having a maybe main point of narrative. For me, Dunkirk is one of the most effective works from Nolan. It has very little dialogue, but it has more of a mood and atmosphere to it. And that's where his way of making thrilling action set pieces work well to try to explore what it was like to be in that environment, in that story. So this is some of my points about why I just don't think the characters within this film are interesting or developed enough to hold the message together. And that's again where, just like my point on Tenet, has very interesting ideas and themes that I resonate with, and I think the film is clear in trying to explore those ideas. Whereas in Tenet, it doesn't try to distract itself with trying to develop characters and spend time on characters. It is focused on the ideas and having the plot serve those ideas, and also not spending time at the end of the film to explain what the point of the film is as well. Whereas the Odyssey, trying to build characters, but it doesn't know how to build them. To me, the film feels lost. Brings us well into the next point, which is the cinematography and the lighting in general, because I think you cannot divorce the cinematography from its lighting. And a lot of the film, to me, felt like very close-up shots of the faces of the characters, their performances. And this is, of course, fully shot in IMAX. This is the first of its kind film. A new IMAX system, the Keeley, the rest in peace, David Keeley. I was excited to see this, and that's why for me it was a necessity to watch this at the BFIMS, because it's an IMAX palace, so to speak. Of course, with its amazing 17mm projector, 1.43:1 aspect ratio, an amazingly talented and dedicated team of projectionists at the BFI IMAX that I'm very grateful for. Having now seen what it does with that 1.43:1 aspect ratio throughout, I'm not a fan of it. It is like a full experiment of what it's like to see a film fully shot in IMAX, and now having seen that, I don't think I like what I've seen. I would maybe go as far as to say that IMAX as a format is maybe making Nolan a worse director, because just in terms of his tendencies, it's probably pushing him in the wrong direction, because so many of those shots are close-ups of the faces, which in that also New York Times interview he described as something that he really enjoyed, and used a very interesting word. I'm not sure if he really meant to use it, as he finds it rewarding to have a face seen at such a detailed way, larger than life, of course, 1.43:1. Maybe I would feel it was more earned if the characters were interesting enough, but as I've described in everything before this, would feel so drawn into the performance to where point of view of the faces of the actors would bring a lot to the film. I don't think it does. I think an IMAX aspect ratio is best used to highlight scale. And one thing you can say, that this is an epic of mythical proportions. It needs to have the aspect ratio to make these characters larger than life. But as I've also described before this, that the film picks and chooses which parts of the mythical elements from the original The Odyssey it wants to have, and what he wants to make more grounded. And that's where all of these elements don't come together to serve a cohesive film. Despite me enjoying the themes, again, despite me enjoying all of that, I don't think the cinematography supports that. I don't think the narrative changes support that. I don't think the characters support that. There is an interesting idea, just nothing else works in tandem with all of that. Sheesh, I've been talking for an hour, it was time to take a break, and it's getting a little too heated in there, in the t-shirt, so also I don't think it looks too great on the camera with the pattern anyway. So the other point I want to make about the IMAX of it all, and the way that impacts the character performances, is that because of the nature of how big those IMAX film cameras are and how difficult it is to shoot around them, I wouldn't be surprised if there's also some unique aspects around the lenses and how that impacts the bokeh of it all as well, because they're so big. I don't know the specific details around how they needed to shoot around this special IMAX setup. They mentioned mirrors being used. Make sure that the actors have something to act in terms of seeing somebody else in the mirror that they have to act against, and to keep the eye lines going. And I can only assume that has contributed to making the cinematography not as good, in my opinion. Of course, this is the first film of its kind to be shot fully in IMAX, and it had its own unique challenges to navigate that few other films had to. I'm sure throughout the history of cinema there were instances of really difficult cameras. Actors had to work in a specific way to make sure that the cameras, the sound works. This is almost like the early Hollywood talkies age, possibly. There are some types of shots that you would normally see in films that might not be as easy to facilitate in this film, and maybe that contributed to some of the characters being separated, which in a sense would work into the film's themes, where Odysseus is lost and all of the characters feel lost in one way or another. Whether that's Tom Holland's character being lost, unsure where to go and what to do, whether that's Anne Hathaway's character. I was lucky enough to just encounter an interview with Matt Damon randomly, where he described having to work with that mirror setup, and the way he described it, like it didn't have too much impact on his ability to connect with Anne Hathaway in one of the scenes they've done. So maybe some people wouldn't pick up on this as much, but I think had more impact on some scenes than others. But I think in general, having IMAX utilize this in this film, to me at first seemed like a great opportunity and an interesting experiment, to now it just looked like to be a limitation throughout the making of the film, just because of the logistics of having such a huge camera be present on set. My assumption was that this IMAX Keeley setup was meant to be more portable while still retaining the IMAX 1.43:1, but given the size of the IMAX 17mm, I don't imagine that's ever possible. I don't imagine that can ever be done. Maybe there were some scenes that I thought really had interesting eye lines. In the scene with Circe, I believe. So yeah, the witch in the house. There is a scene where you just see the usual A-B, like back and forth shot, where shots, reverse shots. But there is two shots there where it's pretty much her looking in the camera. It's shifted just a little bit, like sort of almost like the way I'm looking like right now. And to me that was odd, the way they broke the framing in that section. Not saying that she was looking straight into the camera, and maybe it was a conscious decision on their part, but for me it mostly felt like it's the limitation of the IMAX film camera shining through. The way Nolan has historically used the IMAX film camera was for the action scenes, which makes sense. It highlights the scale. It makes it more thrilling. But here it's everything, and after a while you get used to it, to the point where it's not even registering. When you watch a normal film and it goes into 1.43:1 aspect ratio, you get a little excited because you understand that something big is coming up. Whereas in Oppenheimer's, first of all, it's not a type of film that has big set pieces to facilitate the usage of 1.43:1, arguably. In that film, the way it can abruptly shift between IMAX and the regular film cameras was really jarring, because it was a very letterboxed widescreen film. It's not even 1.9 or something IMAX to 1.43. It was very big difference between the regular camera and the IMAX camera, and at parts it was really jarring. This wasn't an issue in this film, of course, but it created other issues. So now having seen an IMAX film, fully IMAX, I don't think I want to see one again, or at least not presented in this way. In so many cases seems to be close-up shots of the faces. Although I'm sure I'm very much exaggerating and cherry picking in this case, because it was such a big point that stuck out to me to where I'm now going on for probably a few minutes talking about that specifically. And in general, when it comes to like some of those big IMAX scenes, they didn't feel like they were just as well done as they have been in the past. That's just like with some of those action scenes there towards the end, it was almost like a mess to digest. The lighting, which for me is a big issue in this film, and I will keep bringing this up as often as films keep going for very naturalistic, grounded lighting. Films set in ancient Greece, there's not going to be LED lights all around to provide a good level of visibility across space. There are going to be parts where they're in rooms and there is a few torches around the place to just light up the room. There are going to be parts where they are at night and it's dark, and all they're going to have is the light from a bonfire to keep them bright. So there's only one source of lighting illuminating a little bit of a scene, which is also probably like one of the big limitations for them, because they were thinking to themselves, we have to have grounded natural lighting, or we can't get creative or surrealistic with imagery because it has to be real. And on that as well, the IMAX potential is wasted because it's all so dark and boring visually. It's ugly. It's an ugly film. And it's bizarre to me that Nolan would express his love for the film as a medium of shooting and comment on the texture that they get in terms of course, the softness of it all. Although on IMAX and 70mm, if anything, it's just almost hyper sharp. Although, well, it's not the same as digital. Ignore me. It's a different level of sharpness, I'll say it that way. And he commented that the way the analog colors look. Yes, but not in the case of the Odyssey. It doesn't. No. I like my films where the night scenes look blue instead of dark. This might sound as a nitpick, but a dark scene on an IMAX 70mm projector does not look dark. It looks gray, which is even worse. So if you had some blue light in the scene because it's a film, it is supposed to look surrealistic, it would have maybe been less of a problem. And surely IMAX, the sensor on that camera is giant enough to where they're able to have maybe more light go in. I'm not sure on the details of what kind of film stock they use for this. I'm not sure if there are different types of IMAX film stock, what kind of light sensitivity they have. This is a little bit out of my depth. I don't exactly have an IMAX film camera on hand to play around with. Nolan, give me a ring. I'd like to have one, please. And yeah, so much of it just looks visually bland and within those rooms, and there's not much to look at. Well, I suppose when most of your shots of people talking are just close-ups of the faces, then it makes sense that you can just have one light source illuminating one half of the face and the other half is just a little bit dark. Sure, but some of the bigger like fights, the Trojan horse fight is not good looking. It's dark, it's too dark, I can't see anything. Why are you gonna go through such lengths to create this visual, practical thrill ride of a set piece and make it so it's so dark that I can't see anything? Why? And that was what I was thinking when I was watching the previews they were doing of that Trojan horse scene in the beginning, with them opening the gate, and then John Odyssey comes through the gate all cool looking and all that, and I was like thinking, it's like, this doesn't look good. It just doesn't. It's too dark. Many people be like, yeah, this is great, it's so real, it's so grounded, so real, so naturalistic. Buddy, it's about gods, and there's like, are we actually gonna be out here treating this as a very grounded film when there are sirens in the film? There's a cyclops, and we're gonna draw the line at lighting has to be grounded? I don't understand how Nolan can be such a proponent of the old ways of filmmaking when his ideas about lighting and some other cinematography technicalities seem to be so contemporary to the film's demise almost. That is genuinely the biggest issue I have with the film, that is just ugly to look at. And I think for a film that is dealing with mythical elements, there is so much opportunity to provide interesting visuals, colors, make it surrealistic a little bit at times. I think with a story of that kind, there is room for that. Maybe get a little bit expressionist there as well. Do something, please. Do something. Or at least do it like Ron did, do it like Andrei Rublev did, or some other Andrei Tarkovsky films. Why? Why does it look so bland? Why does it look so dull? There are no memorable shots for me in this film, genuinely. I find that so disappointing. I wouldn't name Nolan as somebody who's known for his distinct visual style. No, he's a writer and director who's strongest at high concept ideas and stories. That is still the case here, but whereas something like Oppenheimer, you're too preoccupied with the thematic foundation of the film and the character analysis of Oppenheimer, here there isn't such a big focus on Odyssey, to where I feel like I can dismiss the poor cinematography. And I think at this point, the budget of this film was big enough. There was enough things with this film to where we should demand more of Nolan. And some of the dedication to practical effects, I think, is working against him as well. This is something that people criticize with Oppenheimer, with the nuclear blast scene not having the scale of impact, the shockwave, the actual scale of the explosion, as people would have hoped for. And I didn't have as much of an issue with it. I enjoyed it being more abstract. But it would have been also nice to just have the scale of it. And here, of course, I'm sure there's lots of invisible VFX work that we just don't know too much of. But with the Cyclops scenes, it looked very clear to me that it was just some really creative, elaborate compositing work. Or I'm not even sure what they would have done specifically, or whether it's somebody on a green screen. The impact of the Cyclops interacting with some of the environment was lost because there was, in that scene with the cave, he would have squished some of the soldiers, and it did not feel like it had an impact whatsoever to me. That's where the dedication to the practical effects is working against the impact of the story at that moment. At least for me, that wasn't. This is only a small example of that. I think there are just more examples of where the film might have been more visually interesting and creative if Nolan embraced the mythological origins of the story and maybe did something more interesting with that. But at this point, it seems like a little bit of a silly argument to have, because I'm just now asking for the film to be something it really much isn't. But then that goes the question, why even choose to adapt this if you're gonna dismiss so much of the film or what it's trying to do? That was also a little bit strange to me. And I think I'm mostly running out of points I want to cover. It's funny to see some elements in the Odyssey overlap with some of the previous works from Nolan. in that also New York Times interview, he mentioned that rereading that, he understood how much of his work has been inspired by it, naming it the text, something that is the archetype or the prototype for everything else to build upon. And that's where, well, it's a spoiler, I suppose, for 2 films, actually. This is also spoilers for Inception, by the way. So if you're already 1 hour in, you're too locked in now. This is like already a 1 hour in. The parallel between Odysseus stuck with Calypso on the beach is not too different from Leo DiCaprio being stuck on the beach in Inception. That was like an interesting parallel to me. I was like, it's almost the same. There's probably more examples you can get if you really wanted to. That was just the only one that I thought was very, very similar. And that's where I think the Odyssey is more meaningfully interacted with as a foundation for Western literature, as based on some of the research I've done. By research, I mean I just read the Wikipedia article. At least I didn't use ChatGPT or another LLM, so it could have been worse, yeah. It is, of course, because of how long ago it was written and how many elements exist within that early work that was produced before Common Era, actually. It's BCE, Jesus wasn't even born yet, guys, okay? And how much of that is still known to people as common knowledge. The Trojan horse, everybody knows about that. And that story would have served as the foundation for so many other stories to build upon. At this point, we're so far into the development of civilization. The trust of people to keep the stories going through generation and generation, to where it's left an imprint, to where the Odyssey would have inspired countless works that in turn would have inspired Inception and Nolan. The most fascinating element, and to now have the Odyssey adaptation that has some level of recognition as an Odyssey adaptation, because I'm sure somebody else would have done that previously, but I don't know any to my knowledge. That of course doesn't mean it hasn't been done by somebody, it just means it hasn't been notable enough to pop up on my radar. I dabble in the cinephile area, so I think I would have heard of one if there wasn't one. So I'm glad that this exists, but I think the potential of it is way larger. Which I think was... Let me just see if I have some other things I want to say. I think I've, at this point, discussed most of the things I wanted to discuss, because I have my notes here and post-it notes as well. This is probably an hour long at this point. I've cut out some of the things, for sure, just to trim it down a little bit, but a few other things I would like to touch on is I'm surprised that this has such a strong positive reception from the critics. And I am generally baffled, because I think this is Nolan's epic fail. Out of all of the films he's done, this is the one that I think's most clearly missed the mark, despite having the foundation of something very interesting and fascinating. I'm glad it exists, and I interact with it. I don't try to just dismiss the film, despite me having many issues with it, as I've just described. I think there's still interesting ideas at the core, so I did not just blatantly dismiss any of the ideas that the work has at its core. But it is a little bit frustrating. I would even say that so many people seem to love this so much, because I don't see anything to enjoy here in particular. I don't think it comes together whatsoever, and I can only assume the issue here is the recency bias, to where most of the critics are so busy watching films that come out right now that they need to review as part of their job, to where a basic level of doing something more can win favor and recognition and praise. This came out the same week as Moana. Yeah, this is way better than Moana, but doesn't mean that it's a good film. It just means that Moana is really bad. It has been a pretty bad year for films in general, I would say. The big standouts were some of the indie films, and for me, Evil Dead Burn, which is so far my favorite film of the year, and I think that's gonna change. Maybe they really have watched so many bad films as part of their job that they forgot what a really good film looks like. And there's so much praise for the acting of Matt Damon, Pats, Tom Holland, but it's so also forgettable just because the characters are so forgettable. They wouldn't even blame the actors. As you would have noticed through all of this, I've not spoken about the actors whatsoever, but not because I think they are bad and they've not done a good job. I just don't think they have much to work with here. That's because, as I've described, Nolan is not very good at writing characters, so there's not much for them to work with. Tom Holland can do one-liner quips in Spider-Man and in here as well. There is no real character arc for him. He fails at everything he sets out to do, and then yeah. So I think I'm pretty much there in terms of summing this up. I suppose to sum this up, the Odyssey is an example of what you get when you put Matt Damon in a film where he has to find his own way home instead of having somebody else save him. Do you get it? Because Saving Private Ryan, that's Matt Damon. The Martian, that's Matt Damon. Interstellar, we also have to save Matt Damon. The Odyssey, Matt Damon has to save himself and find his own way home. And you see, it just doesn't work. Well, the last point I have is that there are films that do the Odyssey better, in a sense, that have a similar, almost like idea of what they're doing, but they do it better. I wasn't really planning to do this as a section, but then just the film came up in my head, and then I decided to do this as a little bit of a postscriptum, because discussing the Odyssey is something to adapt in a different format rather than directly. For example, The Warriors is a film that I watched this week, so it's very fresh in my mind, which is a film about a few gangsters from the gang called Warriors who go to a meeting, and then a war kind of breaks out, and then they have to find their own way home, and some people get tested on the way and end up in prison or dying, and the other ones try to find their own way home. Is that not the Odyssey? It has its own differences, for sure, but it's also a film that looks it's so stunning. That is what cinema should look like. I can excuse a lot to a film that looks amazing. And another one I kind of want to mention as an epic, although it's not really an epic in the conventional sort of way, and that is Werner Herzog's Aguirre, The Wrath of God. It is different in the sense that it's not about them trying to find their way home, but it is an odyssey in its own way. But what I think that film does so well is provide a very epic scale, and like realism that in that film belongs, because that film does not have any actual supernatural elements, and is able to provide an exploration of the characters and the impact of the environment on the characters. It's interesting for Nolan to mention Ron and the interplay between the environment and the wind when he has such a dismissal of things in general. Like, there is no notable mise-en-scène in that film. So it's funny for me that he would say that. But Aguirre has a lot more going on there, and that's why I think it's an interesting film and an epic, but on a small scale. And that film, and with that film, whenever I mention that, I always like to point out that that film was influential on Edward Yang specifically, who was in Canada at the time that that released, and he was lucky enough to see it in a theater, and that convinced him to become a filmmaker. And that is the power of strong filmmaking. And what that film showed him is that you can do a large-scale picture with a small budget in a really beautiful way. I still don't think I even have the words to summarize why some of Werner Herzog's pictures are so effective. And within that, there is a level of beauty to it that I don't think I can attribute to the Odyssey. And now that I'm going on a little bit of a different direction, I think if you've watched so far, thank you so much. And I hope you stick around, because the whole point of this channel is to make sure that people learn about cinema of different kinds, and I can maybe serve as something of a guide for you to find actually good films to watch. I suppose while I'm here, Nolan mentioned Ran by Akira Kurosawa. Watch that. He mentioned Andrei Tarkovsky films. Watch that. Watch all of them, genuinely. I have all of them on Blu-ray, you know. And I only have like one Nolan film on Blu-ray, huh? Actually two, because I also have The Following. I don't have any of the other films, surprisingly enough. So thank you for sticking around and watching all the way through. I hope that I managed to convince some people to reevaluate their opinion of the Odyssey, because I still feel like I will still be very much a contrarian on this. But hopefully with me taking the time to properly explain my issues with the film, you can understand that there is a point that I'm coming from, rather than just blindly hating something that is very popular. And I hope that more people will be a little bit more critical on this film, because it's, after all, a very big film. It's easy to get caught up in the hype rather than taking the time to evaluate it. And when it comes to films of this scale coming out, there is that electrical energy that, especially for critics to be in that room, even though I'm sure they have been in press screenings very many times, so they're still maybe a little bit numb to the experience. But with this one, it still probably would have been a little bit special. The excitement would have been palpable, and that within that, people can get carried away a little bit. Maybe that's where some of the very high scores came about, and we would expect this to maybe calm down a little bit. But in general, I'm not such a big contrarian, except when it comes to Tenet. But as I've already even explained here, Tenet, why I think that worked so well. I will have a dedicated video on Tenet as well, just describing some of the points I've mentioned briefly, but in more detail. Hopefully this did not come out too ranty. I had a very loose idea of some of the talking points I wanted to bring up, and the rest of it I just improvised. So hopefully it was not too bad. Yeah, so hope you stick around. Like, comment, subscribe, watch some good films. And in terms of the format of the Coop-a-Log, which is the show I technically run and this is a part of, but this. So, you know, that's why this is me, this is Nolan. In this review, I've practically obliterated Nolan with my criticism, my facts, my points. I'm actually not sure if I'm gonna watch Odyssey again, because the BFI IMAX is now Odyssey City until September. I'm not sure if they're even gonna show Spider-Man there, considering, I mean, there's a new Spider-Man film coming out. If they're not just gonna show that at the BFI IMAX, this is gonna be interesting. I don't know. Oh, well, there's of course the Cineworld IMAX anyway, which is arguably better for that, considering there's gonna be a usual 1.9 affair, and that's the widest in the UK still. So yeah, maybe I will give it another go and I'll see if my opinions on this change. But at this stage, I would give it a 5 out of 10. If I'm very critical, I'd give it a 4 out of 10, but I think a 5 is just fair enough. And also in terms of music, I have nothing to say. Very boring. And nothing to say. Sorry, Ludwig. I love Tenet. But here, there wasn't any notable scenes in the film as it is. So there wasn't anything to score, I feel like. And because of that, there wasn't anything that came up as memorable. So yeah, I think this is the worst Christopher Nolan film. And he has The Dark Knight Rises in his catalog, okay? Also, just the level of quality between Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises is fascinating, genuinely, because Dark Knight Rises is a very strange film. I think something happened to Chris Nolan after 2008 and The Dark Knight. I think he took a gap after The Dark Knight. Didn't he do Interstellar, I think? Or the idea that that film has are more interesting than their execution. And similar to the Odyssey, I suppose. But now I just am getting too much off point. We're talking about the Odyssey here, so yeah. See you in the next one. Coop-a-Log out. And please watch Evil Dead Burn. Please watch Evil Dead Burn. And I have a review on Evil Dead Burn if you are not convinced, and if you are the person that hates horror films and is squeamish about horror, that is definitely not your film. So yeah, maybe skip that one then. But if you're a little brave, if you're a little brave warrior, a little brave soldier, go ahead and seek out Evil Dead. By the way, Evil Dead Burn, that is a film that has a style. That is a film that has a visual identity. That is shot at anamorphic lenses. That is beautiful. And there is a night scene there. You can actually see everything. It's blue. It's just like, it's beautiful. That is what I want the films to be. That film functions at such a level of pedigree that